Hello everyone, welcome to the Mysterious Stories channel, where you'll discover the most mysterious, scary, and fascinating stories. Make sure to turn up the volume and get ready for a spine-chilling experience you won't forget. My grandfather told me this story when I was a kid, always warning me about the price of war. The names of the soldiers have been changed, but the horror that remains true. It was 1967. Deep in the heart of the Vietnam War, the jungle was alive with danger, both human and otherwise. Sergeant Jack "Blackjack" Thompson and his team received a new mission. An A-1 Skyraider had been shot down in enemy territory, its pilot presumed dead. Their objective was simple: to let Grimm retrieve the body and any sensitive information from the wreckage before the Viet Cong got there. The mission was dangerous. They would have to navigate through thick jungle under constant threat of ambush. But what unnerved them most wasn't the enemies they could see, it was the unseen. The local soldiers had whispered rumors of haunted jungles, of spirits trapped in these lands. Blackjack dismissed them as nonsense. War was hell enough without worrying about ghosts. That morning, the team assembled: Blackjack, Corporal Davis, Private Ramirez, and four others. They moved out at dawn, the jungle swallowing them whole as they advanced on foot. The air was thick with humidity, and every step forward felt like wading through a swamp of vines, insects, and unseen eyes. As they walked deeper into the jungle, the sound of life began to fade. No birds, no insects, just an eerie silence that made everyone uneasy. It was as if the jungle itself was watching, waiting. The trees, once green and full of life, seemed to darken as they neared the crash site, their branches twisted and gnarled like skeletal fingers reaching out to them. After hours of trekking, they finally found the crash site. The Skyraider had plummeted into a small clearing, its twisted metal carcass half buried in the earth. Smoke still rose faintly from the wreckage, but there was no sign of the pilot or his body. "Fan out. Look for the pilot," Blackjack ordered, his voice low and tense. The men moved cautiously, eyes scanning the shadows. As they searched, something felt wrong. The air grew colder, unnaturally so for the jungle. Davis swore he saw movement near the trees, but when he looked closer, there was nothing there. Ramirez heard whispers, faint and indecipherable, carried on the wind. Each man felt it in their guts, something was watching them. They found the pilot's body near the wreckage, half buried under debris. His face was pale, eyes wide open in terror, as if he had seen something far worse than death in his final moments. "Let's get him out of here," Blackjack muttered, his eyes scanning the tree line. Just as they began to lift the body, a low moan echoed through the jungle, sending chills down their spines. It wasn't the wind, the sound was guttural, like a human voice twisted by agony. "Did you hear that?" Ramirez whispered, his eyes wide. "Shut it," Blackjack snapped, but his voice trembled slightly. The silence that followed was suffocating. As they secured the pilot's body in a makeshift stretcher, the jungle seemed to close in on them. The shadows grew darker, and the twisted trees loomed closer. And then, the whispers started again. This time, they were clearer. "Help me." Private Miller, one of the youngest in the group, froze. "Who said that?" Blackjack turned to him. "Nobody said anything. Kid, let's move." But Miller wasn't convinced. He stared into the darkness beyond the trees, his rifle shaking in his hands. The whispers grew louder, coming from all directions now. Voices, all pleading for help, for release. They were surrounded by the unseen, and the temperature dropped even further. Their breath misted in the cold air, an impossible sight in the sweltering jungle. Suddenly, the ground beneath them shifted, as if something beneath the soil was moving. The men froze, fear creeping into their bones. They were soldiers, trained for war, but this was something else. From the corner of his eye, Blackjack saw a shadow dart between the trees, faster than any human could move. He raised his rifle, but there was nothing there. Only the jungle, and the whispers growing louder. The jungle pressed in around them, suffocating in its silence. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as the team carried the pilot's body through the underbrush. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the very earth wanted to swallow them whole. Sergeant Blackjack Thompson kept glancing over his shoulder, his instincts screaming that something was wrong. He'd been through hell and back in this war, but nothing had prepared him for the creeping dread that now gnawed at him. "Keep moving," he ordered, his voice strained. "We're not far from the extraction point." Corporal Davis wiped sweat from his brow, but it wasn't just the heat making him sweat. "Sarge, I swear I saw something back there, something moving." "Cut the crap, Davis," Blackjack snapped, though his eyes betrayed his own unease. "The jungle plays tricks. Focus." But deep down, even Blackjack knew this wasn't just the jungle. The cold air, the whispers, the strange shadows, they all felt real. Too malicious. Private Miller lagged behind, his face pale and eyes wide with terror. He kept glancing around, clutching his rifle like a lifeline. "Sarge, the voices, they're getting louder." Before Blackjack could respond, Ramirez, who was walking ahead, suddenly froze. "Ramirez, what is it?" Blackjack called, his grip tightening on his rifle. Ramirez didn't answer. He stood motionless, staring into the trees ahead. Blackjack and the others rushed up to him, the whispers growing into a cacophony around them. "Ramirez, snap out of it," Davis yelled, shaking him. But Ramirez just pointed, his hand trembling. "Look." The men followed his gaze. Just beyond the trees, through the dim light of the setting sun, they saw an old, decrepit village. The wooden huts were broken and overgrown with vines, the place long abandoned. But that wasn't what made their blood run cold. At the edge of the village stood a figure. It was a man. Or at least it had once been. His tattered pilot's uniform clung to his skeletal frame, and his eyes, empty and hollow, stared directly at them. The name on his uniform read Captain Harris, the same name as the pilot they were carrying on the stretcher. For a long, terrifying moment, none of them moved. The figure just stood there, unmoving, as if waiting for them. "We've got Harris here," Miller whispered, his voice cracking. "So, what the hell is that?" The figure didn't speak. It just slowly raised its hand and pointed towards the center of the village. Blackjack felt a cold chill run down his spine. "We need to get out of here. Now!" But before they could turn, the ground beneath them trembled. A soft, muffled sobbing filled the air, coming from all directions. They looked around wildly, but there was no one. Just the trees and the abandoned village. Then, from the shadows of the village huts, more figures began to emerge. Men, women, children, faces twisted in pain, their eyes hollow, their clothes stained with blood. Ghosts of the village, trapped in this cursed place, their souls forever bound to the horrors that had befallen them. The soldiers froze in terror as the apparitions moved closer, their mouths opening and closing, whispering in a language none of them understood. "Move," Blackjack shouted, his voice cutting through the fear. "Fall back. Get to the extraction point." They ran. The jungle seemed to come alive around them as they fled, the whispers chasing them through the trees. The ground shook beneath their feet, as if the earth itself was rejecting their presence. But no matter how fast they ran, the whispers followed, relentless and hungry. "Faster," Blackjack yelled, his heart pounding in his chest. Davis was the first to fall. One moment, he was running beside them. The next, he was gone, dragged into the underbrush by invisible hands. His screams echoed through the jungle before being cut off abruptly. "Davis!" Ramirez screamed, turning back. "No, keep moving," Blackjack barked, dragging him forward. "We'll be next if we stop." As they neared the extraction point, the air around them grew colder still. The trees twisted and bent in unnatural ways, their branches clawing at the sky. The whispers became deafening, drowning out their thoughts. Finally, they burst into a small clearing where their extraction helicopter was supposed to be waiting, but the clearing was empty. There was no helicopter, no salvation. The whispers stopped. For a moment, everything was deathly silent. Then, from the shadows of the trees, The figure of Captain Harris emerged once more. This time, he was closer. His hollow eyes bored into them, and his mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. "You should have left us here," he whispered, his voice barely audible, and then the shadows closed in. The shadows seemed to swallow the clearing whole. Blackjack Thompson stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest as the ghostly figure of Captain Harris drifted toward them, his eyes hollow and filled with an unspeakable sorrow. The jungle had gone silent, no rustling leaves, no insects, only the oppressive weight of death. Ramirez fell to his knees, his face pale with terror. "We're going to die here, Sarge, just like them." Blackjack grabbed Ramirez by the collar, yanking him to his feet. "Get a grip. We're not dead yet." Miller, the youngest of the group, trembled as he clutched his rifle. His wide eyes darted between the approaching ghosts and the dark jungle around them. "Where's the extraction chopper?" "Sarge, they said they'd be here." "They'll come," Blackjack growled, though he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. "We just need to hold out." But deep down, he knew the truth. The jungle, the ghosts, and the cursed village, they were trapped in something far beyond his understanding. There was no escaping this place. The air grew colder still, and the whispers returned, louder and more insistent than before. Ghostly figures drifted through the trees, men, women, children, all of them with the same hollow eyes, all staring at the soldiers with a silent, accusing gaze. One of the apparitions, a young girl with tangled hair and blood-stained clothes, stepped forward. Her mouth opened, and the sound of her sobbing filled the clearing. The sound was chilling, like nails scraping against glass. "We're sorry," Ramirez shouted, his voice cracking as he backed away. "We didn't mean to disturb you. Please, just let us go." The girl didn't respond. Instead, she raised a hand, pointing toward the jungle. From the darkness, a dozen more figures emerged, other soldiers, dressed in uniforms from decades ago. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes dead, and their bodies covered in wounds. They were the lost, those who had never made it out. Blackjack felt the weight of their gaze bearing down on him, as if the spirits themselves were demanding retribution. "We need to move. Now," he shouted. He turned to run, but the jungle itself seemed to conspire against them. The trees loomed taller, their branches twisting like gnarled hands, blocking every path. The ground beneath their feet felt as though it was shifting, pulling them deeper into the cursed land. Suddenly, Miller screamed, "It's got me! Help!" He was yanked backward by invisible hands, dragged into the thick foliage. "Miller!" Blackjack yelled, spinning around and grabbing at the air. But Miller was already gone, his screams fading into the jungle. Ramirez stood frozen, his hands trembling. "Sarge, this is it. We're all gonna die here." "Not if we fight," Blackjack said, his voice hard as steel. "We're not going down without a fight." He lifted his rifle and fired into the shadows. The bullets ripped through the jungle, but the ghosts did not flinch. They kept coming, their hollow eyes fixed on the living intruders. Blackjack knew the bullets wouldn't stop them, nothing physical could. But he had no other option. "We stick together," Blackjack ordered, his eyes scanning the trees. "Find higher ground. Maybe we can make it to the ridge and signal the chopper." Ramirez nodded weakly, his fear overwhelming him, but not enough to stop his legs from moving. They pushed forward through the thick underbrush, the jungle closing in on them from all sides. The ground became uneven, and every step was a struggle, as if the earth itself was trying to hold them down. The whispers intensified, swirling around them like a storm. Ghostly faces appeared in the trees, their eyes watching, waiting. The air felt heavy, suffocating, making it harder to breathe. Ramirez suddenly stopped, his face pale. "Sarge, I can't breathe. Keep moving, Ramirez." "Don't stop now," Blackjack urged, but he could feel it too. The weight on his chest, the tightening of his throat. It was like the jungle was draining the life out of them, bit by bit. They stumbled into a small clearing at the base of a hill. The air was slightly clearer here, but the oppressive feeling remained. They could see the ridge ahead, but it looked impossibly far. "We're close," Blackjack muttered, though he wasn't sure if he was saying it for Ramirez or for himself. But as they moved toward the hill, a figure appeared at the top. A man, dressed in a tattered pilot's uniform, his body twisted and broken. It was Harris again, the dead pilot they'd been sent to retrieve. His face was contorted in pain, his eyes dark and empty. "You can't leave," Harris's voice echoed through the clearing, though his lips didn't move. "You belong to the jungle now." Ramirez let out a scream and fired wildly at the ghost, but the bullets passed through harmlessly. Blackjack grabbed him, pulling him away. "We have to move, now." But before they could take another step, the ground beneath them cracked open with a sickening rumble. The earth gave way, and they fell, tumbling into the darkness below. Blackjack hit the ground hard, his vision blurring as the world spun around him. Pain shot through his body, but he forced himself to his feet. The air down here was even colder, and the whispers were louder, deafening. He looked around and saw Ramirez lying motionless a few feet away, his body twisted at an unnatural angle. There was no sign of life in his eyes. "Ramirez," Blackjack whispered, his heart sinking. But there was no time to grieve. The whispers were growing louder, the shadows closing in. And then he saw them, dozens of figures emerging from the darkness, their hollow eyes fixed on him. The lost souls of the jungle, the ones who had never escaped. Blackjack raised his rifle, his hands trembling. He knew it was useless, but it was all he had left. "Come on." Then he growled, his voice hoarse. "Let's finish this." And the shadows descended? The world around Blackjack Thompson seemed to slow as the shadows enveloped him. The air was heavy, thick with the stench of decay and the weight of hundreds of forgotten souls. The jungle had turned into a prison, a living entity that pulsed with malevolent energy, refusing to release its captives. Blackjack's breath came in ragged gasps. His rifle, though clutched tightly in his hands, felt more like dead weight than a weapon. The ghosts, the hollow-eyed figures of the fallen, pressed closer, their whispers wrapping around him like chains. From the corner of his eye, he saw movement. Ramirez's lifeless body stirred, twisting in ways that no living man could endure. His eyes, once filled with fear, were now black voids, staring directly into Blackjack's soul. "Ramirez," Blackjack's voice trembled despite himself. But the thing that had once been Ramirez didn't respond. It rose to its feet, moving jerkily, as though its limbs were no longer its own. A twisted smile crept onto its face, a cruel, unnatural grin. Behind him, more soldiers, more apparitions, began to crawl out from the earth, their bodies mangled and broken. Blackjack stumbled backward, his heart racing. There was no escape. The jungle closed in on him like a vice, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. His thoughts began to blur, a mix of fear, confusion, and exhaustion. I can't stay here," he muttered, his mind struggling to cling to sanity. Suddenly, through the cacophony of voices and the suffocating darkness, he heard a voice, clear and strong, cutting through the madness. "Blackjack, you're not alone. Get up." He spun around, and there, standing just beyond the edge of the darkness, was Captain Harris, the real Harris. Not the twisted, ghostly figure he had seen before, but a man, solid and alive. His uniform was blooded, his face haggard, but his eyes burned with determination. "Harris." Blackjack blinked in disbelief. How Harris didn't answer. Instead, he gestured for Blackjack to follow. "We don't have much time. They're coming for you." Without thinking, Blackjack stumbled after him, his feet unsteady as the ground seemed to shift beneath him. Harris moved with purpose, leading him deeper into the jungle. The whispers grew fainter as they moved, but the feeling of being watched never left. As they ran, the jungle around them seemed to warp and twist, the trees bending unnaturally as if they were alive. The path ahead was narrow and treacherous, roots and vines threatening to trip them at every step. Blackjack's mind raced. How was Harris here? Hadn't he been dead, just like the others? But there was no time for questions. The only thing that mattered now was survival. They reached a small clearing. surrounded by towering trees that seemed to form a natural barrier. Harris stopped, turning to face Blackjack with an expression of grim resolve. "This is where we make our stand," Harris said, his voice low but steady. "They won't stop until they take us both." Blackjack looked around, his eyes darting nervously. "Stand against what? We're fighting ghosts, Harris. How do we fight something that's already dead?" Harris met his gaze, his eyes hard. "We're not fighting them. We're fighting the jungle. This place, it's alive. It's feeding off our fear, our pain. And it's not going to let us go unless we force it to." Blackjack clenched his fists, frustration bubbling up inside him. "And how do we do that?" Harris pointed to the trees. "These spirits, the ones that have been haunting us, they're tied to this land. They can't leave because the jungle won't let them. But if we destroy the heart of this place, if we burn it down, maybe we can break the curse." Blackjack's mind raced. Burn the jungle. The idea seemed impossible, reckless even, but what choice did they have? They were outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded by an army of the dead. "How do we find the heart?" Blackjack asked, his voice quieter now, more resigned. Harris knelt down, drawing something in the dirt with his finger. It was a crude map, showing their location and a spot deeper in the jungle, marked with an X. "There's an old temple," Harris explained, his voice grim. "The locals used to worship there, long before the war. I think that's where the curse started. If we can reach it, destroy whatever's inside, maybe we can end this." Blackjack stared at the map, his gut churning with unease. "And what if we're wrong?" Harris gave him a sad smile. "Then we'll die here, just like the others." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The jungle around them was eerily quiet, as if it was holding its breath, waiting for them to make a move. Finally, Blackjack nodded. "All right, let's do it, but we need to be quick. They'll be coming for us soon." Harris stood, a determined look on his face. "We need fire. Lots of it." They scavenged what they could, gathering dry wood and leaves, anything that would burn. Blackjack fashioned a makeshift torch from a branch and some cloth, dousing it in fuel from a cracked canteen. As he lit the flame, the fire flickered weakly at first, then roared to life, casting long shadows on the ground. With the torch in hand, they set off toward the temple, the oppressive jungle closing in around them. Every step felt heavier than the last, the weight of the curse bearing down on them. The whispers returned, faint at first, but growing louder, more insistent. And then they saw the temple, ancient and crumbling, hidden deep within the jungle. Vines and roots had overtaken the stone walls, but there was no mistaking it. This was the heart of the jungle. Blackjack's breath caught in his throat. "This is it." Harris nodded, his face set in grim determination. "We burn it to the ground." They approached the entrance, but as they did, the ground beneath them trembled. The whispers became deafening, and the ghosts, the ones they had tried so hard to escape, began to materialize all around them. "We don't have time," Harris shouted, lighting a second torch and tossing it toward the temple. The fire caught instantly, the dry vines and leaves going up in flames. The jungle roared in response, the ground shaking violently as if the very earth was fighting back. The ghosts screamed, their hollow eyes wide with rage, but the fire spread quickly, consuming the temple and everything around it. Blackjack and Harris backed away as the flames grew higher, the heat intense against their skin. The jungle howled, a sound that wasn't quite human, and the spirits began to vanish, their forms dissolving into the smoke. For a moment, it seemed like the curse had been broken, but then, from the heart of the flames, something emerged, something darker, more ancient than the spirits they had faced, and it was coming for them. The inferno consumed the temple with ferocious intensity, but the jungle's resistance only seemed to grow stronger. Blackjack Thompson and Captain Harris stood frozen at the edge of the flames, their hearts pounding in sync with the deafening roar of the fire. The air crackled with a dark energy, as if the very soul of the jungle was awakening to defend itself. From the heart of the flames, a figure emerged. It wasn't a ghost like the soldiers they had seen before. This thing was far worse. Its form was vague, shifting, and its body seemed to be made of shadow. Flickering in and out of existence, it strode toward them. The creature's eyes glowed an eerie, burning red, and its elongated limbs twisted unnaturally as it moved. Harris' breath hitched in his throat. What is that? Blackjack could feel the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. Something the jungle's been hiding. Whatever it is, it's pissed off. The creature let out a low, guttural growl that reverberated through the ground beneath their feet. As it came closer, the air around it seemed to grow colder, the flames dimming in its presence. The jungle had unleashed its protector, and this ancient being wasn't going to let them escape easily. We need to move, Blackjack shouted, his voice hoarse from the smoke and fear. But just as they turned to flee, the shadows stretched out, tendrils of darkness snaking toward them, wrapping around their legs like cold, dead hands. Blackjack felt his body jerk backward, the force of the creature pulling him closer to the raging fire. He slammed his rifle against the ground, trying to gain any leverage he could, but the pull was relentless. "Thompson, hang on," Harris screamed, reaching out to grab his arm. Together, they struggled against the force of the creature, its dark energy growing more oppressive with every passing second. The firelight flickered, casting eerie shadows across the twisted vines that surrounded them, as if the jungle itself was alive and conspiring against them. With a final desperate pull, Harris yanked Blackjack free from the grasp of the shadowy tendrils, and they both stumbled backward, gasping for air. The creature let out a bone-chilling screech, its red eyes locking onto them as it stepped through the flames unscathed. "We can't fight that thing," Blackjack panted, his mind racing. "It's not human." Harris shook his head, a determined gleam in his eyes. "No, but we can destroy this damn jungle." Before Blackjack could respond, Harris grabbed the remaining torch and hurled it into the jungle, igniting the dry leaves and branches. The fire spread quickly, flames licking at the roots of the towering trees. The jungle hissed in protest, the ground trembling beneath their feet. But Harris didn't stop. He tossed another torch, then another, until the entire forest around them was ablaze. The creature roared, its body flickering violently as the fire raged around it. It lashed out, tendrils of darkness striking the trees and ground, but the fire was too strong. It spread faster than the creature could stop it, consuming everything in its path. But even as the flames grew higher, the jungle fought back. The ground split open with a deafening crack, sending roots and vines bursting from the earth, writhing like serpents. One of them lashed out, catching Harris around the waist and lifting him into the air. "Harris!" Blackjack yelled, but before he could move, another vine shot out, knocking him to the ground. The creature, now consumed by the fire, let out one final, earth-shattering scream before its body dissolved into smoke, vanishing into the night. But the jungle wasn't done with them yet. The flames raged uncontrollably, the heat unbearable as the vines continued to thrash and tear at the ground. Blackjack struggled to his feet, his vision blurry from the smoke. He could hear Harris' strangled gasps as the vine tightened around him, pulling him closer to the burning trees. Blackjack grabbed his knife, slashing wildly at the vines that wrapped around Harris. "Hold on, I've got you." The vine recoiled as Blackjack's knife struck deep, and Harris dropped to the ground, coughing and gasping for air. "We need to get out of here now," Blackjack said, pulling Harris to his feet. "This whole place is coming down." Together, they stumbled through the burning jungle, the flames closing in from all sides. The smoke was thick, choking the air, and the heat was suffocating. The jungle itself seemed to scream in fury, its once impenetrable walls now crumbling in the face of the firestorm. They ran for what felt like hours, their lungs burning and their bodies aching. But the flames followed them, relentless, as if the jungle was determined to take them with it. Just when it seemed like there was no escape, they broke through the tree line and into a clearing. The air was cooler here, and for the first time in hours, they could see the stars overhead. But behind them, the jungle continued to burn, a towering inferno that lit up the night sky. Blackjack collapsed to the ground, his body trembling from exhaustion. Harris fell beside him, coughing violently. "We made it," Harris gasped, his voice weak. Blackjack nodded, though he wasn't sure if they had really escaped. The jungle may have burned, but the darkness that had haunted them still lingered in the air, a malevolent presence that refused to be forgotten. As they lay there, catching their breath, the distant sound of helicopters reached their ears. Reinforcements. Help was finally coming. But, as Blackjack stared up at the stars, a chilling thought crept into his mind. What if the jungle wasn't gone? What if it had simply retreated, waiting for another time, another group of unsuspecting soldiers to stumble into its grasp? Blackjack closed his eyes. The memory of the creature's burning red eyes seared into his mind. Maybe the jungle never truly lets go. The cool night air was a welcome relief as Blackjack Thompson and Captain Harris lay in the clearing, gasping for breath. The jungle behind them was ablaze, but the flickering firelight could not fully banish the lingering sense of dread that clung to them. The distant sound of helicopter blades grew louder, signaling that their extraction was near. Harris sat up slowly, his face smeared with dirt and ash. "We made it," he said, his voice hoarse. But there was no triumph in his words, only exhaustion. Both men knew deep down that surviving the fire didn't mean they had escaped the horrors of the jungle. Blackjack stared at the tree line, his mind racing with the images of what they had just seen. The creature, the soldiers, and the jungle itself, it was all too real. His gut told him this wasn't over. "They'll come looking for us, you know," Blackjack said quietly, still watching the burning jungle as if something might emerge from it at any moment. "The brass will want answers about what happened." Harris shook his head, his hand trembling as he wiped sweat from his brow. "How do we explain any of this? The men who were killed, the shadows, that thing in the fire, none of it makes sense." Before they could contemplate further, the helicopter touched down in the clearing, its rotors blowing dirt and leaves into the air. The door slid open, revealing a group of medics and soldiers who rushed toward them. "You guys are lucky we found you," one of the soldiers shouted over the noise. "We thought you were goners." Blackjack and Harris were helped to their feet and guided toward the helicopter. As they boarded, Blackjack cast one last glance back at the jungle. The flames had diminished, but the darkness beneath the canopy remained as thick and impenetrable as ever. It was as if the jungle was watching them, waiting for its next move. The helicopter lifted off, and as they soared above the burning forest, Blackjack couldn't shake the feeling that they were leaving something behind. Something unfinished. The jungle had let them go this time, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like a warning. As they flew away, Harris slumped against the side of the chopper, closing his eyes for the first time in what felt like days. Blackjack, on the other hand, remained alert, his eyes fixed on the fading treetops below. When they arrived back at base, the medics quickly rushed them into debrief. Major Callahan was waiting, his face grim as he watched the two survivors enter the room. He gestured for them to sit. "Tell me everything," Callahan said, leaning forward with a look of concern. "What happened out there?" Blackjack exchanged a glance with Harris, who looked just as lost for words as he was. How could they explain the unexplainable? The jungle, the shadows, the creature, none of it fit into the military's version of reality. The mission went sideways. Blackjack started cautiously, choosing his words carefully. "We lost our team to something we couldn't see, something that wasn't human." Callahan raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "Not human? What are you talking about?" Blackjack clenched his jaw. There was something in that jungle, Major, a presence. It took out our men, one by one. We tried to burn it down, but it wasn't enough. Harris nodded, his face pale. It was like the jungle was alive. It wasn't just the Viet Cong. There was something else. Something worse. Callahan leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "You're telling me you lost your entire squad to ghosts? Is that what you're saying?" Blackjack stared at the floor, unable to meet the Major's gaze. He knew how it sounded. He didn't even believe it himself, but he had no other explanation. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy. Finally, Callahan sighed, rubbing his temples. "Look, I don't know what you to think you saw out there, but we're going to file this as enemy action. Do you understand? You were ambushed? You barely made it out alive. That's the official report." Harris looked like he was about to protest, but Blackjack placed a hand on his arm, stopping him. There was no point in arguing. They wouldn't believe them. No one would. As they were dismissed and escorted out of the room, Harris turned to Blackjack. "That's it. We just pretend none of this happened." Blackjack shook his head. "We don't have a choice. Let them think what they want, but we know the truth." For days, life at the base returned to normal. The jungle was just a distant memory, a nightmare they were trying to forget. But for Blackjack, the weight of what they had experienced lingered. He could feel it, that same darkness, gnawing at the edges of his mind. One night, unable to sleep, Blackjack found himself standing at the edge of the base, staring out at the distant mountains where the jungle lay hidden. The stars above twinkled innocently, but beneath the canopy, he knew something waited. A low rustling sound caught his attention. He tensed, instinctively reaching for the knife at his side. The sound grew louder, the familiar crackle of leaves and the distant whisper of the wind. But there was something else too. A soft, eerie laugh echoed through the night, sending a chill down his spine. It was the same laugh he'd heard in the jungle, the laugh of the shadows. Blackjack's grip tightened on his knife, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew, without a doubt, that whatever haunted the jungle hadn't been destroyed. It had followed them. It was here, watching, waiting. He turned away from the jungle, his jaw set. They may have survived, but the jungle wasn't done with them yet, not by a long shot. If you enjoyed today's story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel, Mystical Tales, so you won't miss out on more eerie and thrilling tales in the future. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.